Thanks very much, everyone. Welcome to the latest in our Morecambe Bay Partnership Sunset series. So those of you who are regular attendees at these will have heard me say this before, but really this was a response initially to lockdown scenario. So Morecambe Bay Partnership are involved in a large number of community projects, natural history projects, heritage projects, access projects all around this wonderful place of Morecambe Bay in the northwest of England. And given that our volunteering activities and our events and our community ways of working couldn't proceed during the last lockdown, we really wanted a way in which we could still get together with our friends and our supporters to continue celebrating the various aspects of Morecambe Bay, the work that we do, and really an opportunity to get together and share things together. And yeah, been massively successful. So they've grown. I think each one of these we've done, we've had more and more members as people have found, I think, a safe space for sharing a love of the Bay, really, and increasingly attracting people from all around the world. So welcome to all of those of you who are not from the northwest of England, as well as our existing friends who we recognise. So due to the numbers, it's slightly different tonight. So it's not going to be maybe quite as chatty as some of them, but we'll see how we get on later. I'd like to introduce Alison Burns, Dr. Alison Burns, who is running our talk tonight, Forests, Footprints and Fauna. Alison is a friend of Morecambe Bay Partnership, has been working with us for a couple of years, and it's kind of comes at the end really of a 10-year period in which Alison has become, I guess, the leading authority on the prehistoric footprints that we have up here on our slightly muddy northwest coast of England. So Alison started out studying what I think are fairly well-known prehistoric footprints at Formby in Lancashire, and via one of our citizen archaeology projects that we have involving local residents in understanding their history and recording their history, became more involved in discovering previously unknown sets of prehistoric footprints at other locations, such as on Walney Island near Barrow. So Alison's going to be taking us back, hopefully a little bit, to how she started working in the area, but back to the Mesolithic period. So 6.5 times further back than the birth of Christ and the Roman invasion of these islands. So 6.5 times further back into history than that, and taking us up to about 2,000 years ago. So we'll take questions at the end, as we always do on these talks, and we'll take the questions via the chat in particular, and we'll say a little bit more about some of the other talks as well that we have coming up. But Alison, I think probably given the delay, I'll hand straight over to you to start your talk. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you very much indeed. I hope you can all see me, and I hope my slides move across the screen as intended. So this is the introduction to this project, which I'm quite excited about, because the coastal archaeology that we have around the whole of the British Isles is really very little talked about, and has an awful lot to offer. There's much more available to us as we walk along the beach than just enjoying the sand and the sea. And so I'm going to talk to you a little bit about my research, but try and talk about the paleoecology and the development of the remains as we see them today as we go along, and then highlight some of the things that we can see in the northwest around the edge of the Irish Sea, and talk at the end a little bit about footprints, how you might get involved in this. So today I want to cover just a couple of aspects of the paleo environment and how we can see it today and what this is actually indicating to us. So first of all, I'm going to talk a little bit about sea level rise after the end of the last ice age and how it affected the paleo landscape and how we see that area today. I'm going to talk also a little bit about the indications that we have that tell us about the past lives that were lived along this coastline, and a little bit about the footprint remains, the tree remains, and things like that that are found along our shoreline.
So yes, so the coastline is very varied in the northwest of England, and I'm going to describe a little bit about the environment under the sea and the coastline itself. So first of all, I'd just like to talk a little bit about some of the terminology that I want to use, because I don't want to overface you and leave you wondering what on earth I'm talking about. So when we're talking about paleoecology, we're talking about ecosystems and past environments. And in this particular case, I'm talking about environments along the coast of the past that also stretched inland some way to form quite a large wetland area in many areas around the southwest. When I'm talking about the Holocene, I'm actually talking about the period of time after the end of the last ice age, about 11,600 years ago, to the present day. And this takes in both prehistoric periods and historic periods. But the coastline that we're talking about and the remnants that we see are mainly prehistoric. I'm also going to just mention relative sea level, and this is localized changes in sea level and fluctuations that occurred that led to both flooding of different areas and sea regressions. Radiocarbon dating is also very important in this context because this enables us to understand what we're actually talking about. So I'm talking about carbon that is found in organic remains and that becomes radioactive, breaking up at a regular rate so that an age range can be given. And I'm going to use the terminology of before present rather than before Christ, because this is used for ecology and geography, and I think it's more appropriate in this sort of environment. And as Tom mentioned, I'm going to talk about things that occurred during the Mesolithic and Neolithic periods. This is the Middle Stone Age and the New Stone Age. So the Mesolithic period was a period of the last hunter-gatherers, and this encompasses a period after the end of the last ice age up to around about 6,000 BP. And the Neolithic period goes from around about 6,000 BP to about 4,000 BP. So as I mentioned, we're talking about a time after the last ice age, and in the early part of the Mesolithic period, the climate was warming enormously and large ice sheets were beginning to melt and shed their water into the oceans. And as part of this, the release of the heavy weight of the ice from the land meant that the areas that had been covered by these ice sheets began to rise. And here we see a picture of the British Isles with a line going across the middle, which represents the hinge. If you can imagine a seesaw, everything to the south of this hinge began to sink, and everything to the north of the hinge that had been covered by glacial ice began to rise. This process is still actually going on today, although at a very slow rate, but maybe a centimetre a year, the south of the UK is still sinking. The release of the meltwaters didn't mean that the land rose in a steady manner. It oscillated. So at times you would have areas of raised land and then they would become submerged again. So at this time, everything was really very dynamic. The seas were constantly changing. There was meltwater taking sediment down into the coasts themselves where they would settle. Under the seabed, there was turbulence with lots of shingle and sand and remnants of what had been land that was now becoming drowned, moving along on the seabed. So this is a plan of the Mesolithic Irish Sea. This is taken from Fitch and Gaffney's West Coast Paleolandscape Survey, which is a very large tome, but it's online and it's very interesting. And they surveyed two areas, the River Severn and the Irish Sea Basin on the eastern side. So we've got the benefit of that. And they surveyed the whole of the Irish Sea area, and they could therefore build up a topography of the seabed as it is today. But this topography indicates the land that used to be dry, but which was gradually inundated over time. And you can see here, this is a very large intertidal area. This is taken from around about 8000 BP. And at that time, the Irish Sea was gradually encroaching on this dry land. As I mentioned before, everything was very dynamic. So at times you would get periods of flooding where the sea would come right up to what is now our coastal area and then recede again. So this happened both locally and on a larger scale as well. But at 8000 BP, it might have been possible to actually walk across to the Isle of Man, unlike the jet skier who jet skied across the other day. So now we see that this area of land is completely submerged, and this area here represents our present coastline. But you can see that the tributaries going out to sea that still exist are followed under the ocean bed as well. Here is a close-up of that, and the incursion of the sea in the Morecambe Bay area led to lots of fluctuations of the sea level, and depending on the topography of the land near to the coast, different types of ecology would develop. So some areas would be developed by, dominated by salt marshes, other by estuarine tidal flats that had very large intertidal areas, like some areas of the Morecambe Bay today. Other areas of the coast developed small areas of sand dune that then stopped the sea encroaching further unless there was a major storm or storm surge. In some areas, shingle barriers developed, and to the north of this area, there were cliffs and also some raised beaches where the tilt of the earth enabled the crust to move above sea level slightly. So if you can imagine, around a lot of the coast of northwest England, large areas of salt marsh were extensively solidified after a period of time, and they would be protected by sand barriers that were mainly submerged but occasionally above sea level further out, so that the powerful open sea didn't necessarily get into these areas of salt marsh unless there was particularly bad weather or some other form of inundation occurred. So you can see here, it's a very rich area. It would have been populated by great numbers of seabirds, by small young fish and crabs. And the mud flats were also very popular to animals that came to graze on the sedges at the edge of the marshes. Animals such as red deer and roe deer were particularly keen on the salt marshes themselves. So although this was quite a difficult area to maneuver in, and because it was an intertidal area, there was always a danger of becoming trapped. Nevertheless, this area drew large numbers of animals and, after a while, humans onto it as well. So this is the succession of the salt marsh as would have been typically seen at that time. And it's no different to the present day. So you would initially get the tidal creek that would be an intertidal area, and behind that mud flats, and behind those sedges and reeds, and then trees. And in this area it would have been oak and alder, and sometimes fir as well. And occasionally this whole area would have been submerged, sometimes for very short periods of time, but sometimes for quite extensive periods of time, maybe even several years. So gradually the hydrosphere, the shape of the ecology would change, and it would become a much more wetland area. But gradually you may well have found that the coastline would have changed in the same area, and it would once again become dry land. And this is why sometimes now on the edge of the coast you can see tree roots sticking up. Yes, that was just a plan that I got from Wikimedia. So you can find out a little bit more about the salt marshes if you like as well from your own reading. And I think it's quite an interesting type of ecology to talk about. So I was wondering about how we can best explain this ecology. What do we see today? What are the remains that we sometimes see along the coast, and what causes them? So in the northwest, in the Irish Sea in particular, there's a prevalent northwest wind that blows across from the Irish Sea, and this causes longshore drift. This is a process whereby materials are lifted off the beach and moved along some distance until they're again able to settle. And this process happens again and again, and this is gradually eroding some areas of the coastline of the northwest of the UK. But also, because the material is moved along, areas are developing, are building, and we're getting green beaches. Areas like Southport have now begun to form a green beach. And where these areas are above sea level, you'll find that sedges and different grasses are also beginning to take hold and keep that area as quite a new and verdant area above sea level. Sometimes we have storms and occasional storm surges, and these actually act to demolish low-lying areas, particularly where there are dunes fronting the coast. And at Formby, where I've done most of my work, you get dune blowout, and this enables the sea then to rush inland for some distance behind the dunes. So it's quite a serious development when the dunes are beginning to get demolished. And certainly at Formby, this is happening at a rate of about 3 to 5, maybe slightly more meters each year. In areas where cliffs front the coast, erosion is caused by fault lines appearing behind the edge of the cliff itself, and this loosens the earth and you get cliff falls, and then the old paleo landscape surface might be revealed. Obviously, coastal erosion is of major concern at the moment when it is combined with an overall rise in sea level as well. And some time ago, a coastal zone assessment was done by Historic England to talk about what coastal assets are at risk and how to manage them. Some areas are going to be let go and they will be allowed to be eroded, but others have a managed retreat approach so that the coastline is being protected to a certain extent. So the remains have been appearing for a very long time, and I just thought it would be very nice to read two quotes to you from many centuries ago. The first was written by a monk called Giraldus Cambrensis in 1191. And he said that a very remarkable circumstance occurred, the sandy shores of South Wales being laid bare by the extraordinary violence of a storm. The surface of the earth, which had been covered for many years, reappeared and discovered the trunks of trees cut off standing in the very sea itself. The strokes of the hatchet appearing as if made only yesterday. The soil was black and the wood like ebony, like a grove cut down, perhaps at the time of the deluge. So to Geraldus, he felt that these things had something to do with the the time of Christ and the Old Testament. It was so extraordinary to have seen them. And then another person more recently wrote about the submerged forest in Hightown, which is on the Sefton coast, which is actually just here. And he wrote a poem about it, which I think again is quite evocative of what we can see. And he said, in some cases when the sea doth bait, down from the shore 'tis wonder to relate, how many thousands of these trees now stand, black, broken on their roots, which once dry land did cover, whence turfs Neptune yields to show, he did not always to these borders flow. So again, it's somebody really being inspired by the antiquity of the forests that they see on the beach. So we know that this process of coastal erosion isn't new, that it's been happening for hundreds of years, and it's still happening today. So at Formby, I looked at the loss of land over a period of time, and these are three maps that we managed to generate. In 1890, the beds of clay, which contained the footprints at Formby, were about 400 meters inland. You can see the beds here in red, and this is the coastline here. And then in 1945, so just over 50 years later, you can see that there wasn't a huge amount of coastal erosion, maybe 350 meters, so maybe 50 meters in all that time, but the coastline had become much, much straighter. However, now in 2015, you can see that these beds are nearly onto the sand itself. And in fact, since this map was drawn up, these beds have gradually encroached into the sand itself as the dunes have been knocked back. So as Tom said, I've been quite interested in looking at other areas around our area of the Northwest to see what other remains there are. And many of them are there and are recognised by local people, but remain unpublished. So one of the most striking areas is Cleverleys, which is just south of the Morecambe Bay area. And if you go there at low tide, you will see that there are two rows of huge trees on the beach. One row is very close to the promenade and the other further out, but they're really very, very striking. The other that I think is really great is Formby, and this is one of the beds here where we recorded several hundred footprints belonging to different animals and humans. And this is the submerged forest at Hightown. You can see here probably an oak tree felled, and around the base of the oak are royal fern, which no longer grows in the UK. But out of these tree roots and the ferns and things like that that would have covered the understory, people often find both stone tools and animal bones. Another area that is of great interest and is not really documented in any very clear way is Tellacre and Splash Point in Rhyl. Splash Point has had some investigation of it, but Tellacre has had none. And as you can see from the beach area here, it just looks like an ordinary beach. But up at the top edge near the dunes, you will find clay beds such as this one. And this is a photogrammetry plate that we made of two sets of human footprints. So there is much more to say about all these different areas around the coast. Most of them are undated, so we don't really know the antiquity of some of these particular areas. But we do know that Hightown dates from around about 5,500 BP. Formby somewhat earlier than that, about 8,500 BP. So, you know, there's a range of dates that we're looking at when we talk about these Holocene beds. So how do the beds appear? They appear slightly differently in different areas because their constituents are different. In the River Severn, where there are also footprint beds, a lot of the beds are actually comprised largely of peat with very little mud. At Formby, as you can see here, these are all photos from Formby, the beds are comprised of mud, different thicknesses of silt. Some beds are very fine, silty mud, others are much more granular. Some are different colours to others, which show that they were formed by different tributaries running down onto the coast. So in this picture here, this is one of the beds, and at the lower corner, where these little stakes are, where we were planning the bed, this is a group of crane prints. And over further on this area here, there were many human footprints as well. And these beds this bed dates from the late Mesolithic period, so around about 6,500 years ago. So I'd just like to talk a little bit about the formation of some of these beds. I was telling you that the sea was particularly dynamic, that the land was also having massive changes happening to it. And these are reflected in the stratigraphy of these beds. So if we take this bed, for instance, underneath, you will see that there's a layer of sand, but on top is quite a thick level of mud. And this, if you look carefully, was formed of micro layers of mud. So there were many events bringing silty mud down onto the coast where it would settle. It would then solidify, and a sand lens, which would represent the sea going over this sand bed, would form. And this process would occur several times. At the top of each of these beds, they would have been wet enough for long enough for people and animals to walk across them, but not so dry that they would not leave their impressions. So this is how you get the footprints forming. So I've been very interested in trying to date the different areas of each of the beds, and to look at the different paleo environment that was present at different times. And these are two cores that I took from Formby. This is from an area to the south of the beach at Formby called Blundell Path, and one of the beds there. And you can see here the mud and sand lenses and how dynamic this area would have been during the Mesolithic period. And the bottom of this dates from about 8,500 BP, and the top about 8,000 BP. So this didn't take very long to form. And if you look here, you can see that it may have been eroded at time by gentle seas taking areas of mud away, but occasionally it was completely inundated long enough for areas of sand to settle within that bed. So you're seeing here a representation of about 200 years. This bed accumulated and then was sealed by sand quite rapidly. On this side, you have a bed that is much newer, that at the bottom dates from about 5,500 years ago, and at the top about 4,000 years ago. So again, it took much longer for this bed to accumulate, but you can see that it formed in a very different environment, a much more calm environment, and one in which it was a bed that was largely exposed to the elements. And this bed would have contained footprints at this area here and here. Usually by this time, footprints of humans rather than many animals. So there were a lot of changes over time, and they are reflected in the beds on the beach today. And I just put this picture in here. This is the footprint of an aurochs. The aurochs was a very large type of wild cattle, very large indeed, and it had a huge heft to it. So what the animal has done is walk in the mud and compress the mud to such an extent that today, when the mud is eroded, it only erodes the looser mud around the outside of that footprint. Sorry, so you're looking at a big weighty animal and more recently eroded mud. But also you can see that the footprint in the top layer is actually in a separate environment to the footprint in the bed beneath it there. So there is a time lap there. So although the mud looks quite flat, this footprint may have been formed some time after the lower mud was actually laid down. So the remnants that we see on some areas of flatter coastline and in some of the estuaries, such as the Ribble, are actually footprints rather than tree stumps. Although quite often nearer to the edge of the estuary or at Formby, near to the dunes, you will sometimes see the tree stumps in the mud as well. But these are some of the wonderful footprints that you can find at Formby. I've just put in a selection of red deer footprints, and you can see that the preservation, due to the encapsulation by sand and the next layer of mud, leaves today a very pristine footprint when the erosion has then taken place. And again, you can see in this bottom picture the foot plinth from the layer above and the footprint from below. So that means that this footprint is considerably older than this one. But nevertheless, you can tell the difference both in size of the animal, that maybe even the sex of the animal. This footprint being a very large one, this is a 10 centimeter division, is a very large male stag. You can also tell something about the activity that was ongoing on the beach. This footprint is actually a red deer footprint, but the cleaves at the front are wide open. So this animal was traveling at speed, and there's no doubt that red deer were hunted in numbers during both the Mesolithic and into the Neolithic period. More recently, we've been trying to record the beds using photogrammetry so that we can cover a much bigger area of the bed. And instead of just taking single photographs, as I've been showing you, we can show the proximity of each of the footprints to each other. You can see the direction of travel, and you can get a much better idea of the activity within each layer of the bed. So here you can see the footprints of a red deer walking steadily across this area. But in this area here, there are some very small footprints which may have been a lynx. It's perhaps a bit unusual to think of a lynx moving around in mud, but different small predators do seem to have been attracted to the salt marshes. I've also recorded footprints of wolves and dogs and possibly other animals such as beaver on the mud flats as well. So humans were also on the salt marshes to a great extent. They don't seem to be actively involved in hunting a lot of the time, but were using the salt marshes as a way of traveling. Often the earlier footprints trend from north to south or back again. So it may be that the salt marshes were a much easier area to travel along than the wetland area inland. And you can see here a selection of footprints. This is a 5 centimeter scale. So this was a small adult. Again, this was a small adult, but sometimes there are patches of footprints like this one, which show children. Children were actively involved on the salt marshes and may have been collecting, foraging for food and things like that. So one of the ideas of the project was to try and record some of the footprints amongst other things around the coastline. And this is a picture of photogrammetry picture that I did of footprints in South Walney, just on the edge of the sea. And these are roe deer here, which we just happened to see. They were eroded very quickly, but I think it's very telling that we can see these footprints now. And here we can see a large bone sticking out of the mud. This must be contemporary with this area of silt because it was very, very strongly embedded. And you can see the many events that laid down the mud above it. This is a meter scale here. So it was a very large bone. And I know that some remains of red deer have been actually taken to the Manchester Museum for dating. As yet, I don't know what the result of that has been, but lots of animal bone has been eroding from this environment in recent times. So I hope that I've whetted your appetite to find out a little bit more about the coast. And I hope that you understand a little more about the formation of the Irish Sea during the early Holocene period and the dynamism that created the landscapes that are still in evidence every now and again when we walk along the beach. And I hope that you have been able to understand a little about some of the intertidal remains that you may see as you walk along the coast. I've given you 3 references here that I thought might be quite helpful for you. The first is the Paleolandscape Survey. The second, the Rapid Coastal Zone Assessment. These are 2 really useful documents to look at for your own information. And the third is Britain at Low Tide. It was episode 2 focused on Merseyside, and that was my TV debut, never to be repeated, but it's very good, and you will be able to see there the beds at Formby, the submerged forest, and some of the footprints that we found in some of the beds. So I do hope you've enjoyed the talk, and sorry for the occasional technical glitch. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alison. That was great. Are we allowed to call you Alison, or is it Dr. Burns?
You can call me Alison.
Okay, just wanted to check. I didn't want to be too informal. So yeah, we've had a couple of questions that have already come in on the chat. Some of them have had some answers from George R.R. Bleakley, I think mainly, but also from Steph. So is Steph a colleague of yours?
No, I don't know Steph.
No, okay. Anyway, Steph might want to introduce themselves, he or she at some point. But yeah, so I've got a couple I've recorded, and then we'll take more if people want to be posting comments on the chat. I think with such a big group, that'll be the best way of taking questions, I think. So a couple that I've written down here. One of them was how were the samples dated? So there was a comment that they were sort of sent off to a team professor at a university, but can you say a little bit more about exactly how we know from a bit how old a bit of mud is?
Yes, the cores that I showed you, I sampled for plant macrofossils. So I took a small section of the mud from a particular area in each of the cores. So in each of the cores, I managed to get 2 samples. So I then dissolved the mud and looked through a microscope to find all the small plant macrofossils that were there. And it was a very labor intensive process because the macrofossils were extremely small. But I was able to identify some seeds, some leaf remains, very small fragments of thorn, things like that. And once you have 30 milligrams of micrograms, sorry, of um, organic material, that's big enough for a radiocarbon sample. So I then was able to send that off to a lab in Ulster actually, and get radiocarbon dating, which has been quite refined. So within about 20 years, I have a good idea of what the dates are for some of the areas of each of the cores that I've taken.
Great. Okay, thank you. Another one here that's just come in. Are there other areas in the world where such remnants of previous inhabitants and geological histories are this visible?
Yes, there are different areas that have footprint remains, and there are many areas that have submerged forests that appear from time to time. There's a book coming out very shortly on footprints that was developed from a conference that I went to, and it describes the different footprint sites around the world. But offhand, there are coastal sites in Argentina, in Canada, in Norway, um, different parts of South America. So France has got several coastal sites. Not all of them date from the Holocene period. Some of them are much older than that. But yes, they can be found in different places all over the world. Not all of the footprint sites are coastal. Some footprints have been found in caves in France, like Lascaux, and in Spain, like Altamira. And some have been found in lava where they've been encapsulated. In Australia, they've been found in Lake Mungo. They're slightly newer, but it's a remnant lake that encapsulated a group of people running across about 3,000 or 4,000 years ago, I think. So you find footprints in different locations. They're not all coastal, but some of the best preserved sites are coastal.
Thank you. I'll tell you, this was going to be my question, but it's relevant, I think, at this point. I was once involved in a dig of a Roman villa site, and one of the things that we found as part of that was a footprint of a parent and a child in basically in a clay tile that they'd obviously stood in it while it was still wet before it had dried. And the extraordinary thing about that was that you could see the toenail of the big toe. And basically what had happened is that they'd obviously not cut their toenails. I guess they didn't have nail scissors that long ago. It was the child, so presumably it hadn't gone kind of old and dry and flaky. But the toenail from must have been 2 inches long, I guess, over the end of the toe. And because you could see where it sort of was pointing in like a claw into the clay beyond the foot. Is there anything like that that's emerged from any of these ones on the Lancashire and Cumbria seaboard?
Yes, yes. Some of the footprints that I was going to show you in next week's talk are very, very clear indeed, because some of the beds were quite viscous when the people walked through them. And there's one footprint trail in particular that are very good that show each individual toe, but on the left foot you can see that the little toe is sticking out, so it's been broken. So this person had broken their little toe, had never had it set properly, and so it had healed at the wrong angle basically. So you can pick up quite a lot of individual characteristics from footprints, and some of them are very, very clear indeed. One of the features that I've noticed as well, talking about toenails, is sometimes you get a forward drag of the foot. And you may have noticed yourself, if you're walking in sand, if you don't lift your foot that clearly, you drag your toenail through the mud or the sand. And these little remnants of activity are caught in some of the footprints as well. So I'll try and find some of those to put into the talk about identifying footprints.
Yeah, that's amazing. There's something, isn't there, around, it's a connection with sort of common humanity down the millennia somehow, when you see, I think particularly the human footprints,
Yes,
when they're that well preserved, because you just look so familiar with what you would see if you went out today with no shoes on.
it's very visceral. I
Yeah.
used to do walks for people at Formby, and most people would really have to touch the footprint. They couldn't just look at it, they needed to touch it because there was that instant connection.
Yeah. Yeah, and that kind of, this links in, I think, to one of the other questions we've had, which I think in some ways is an obvious question, and something I felt when I saw the ones at Formby for the first time. I was really struck with how fragile they were, partly because the sediment they're in is not rock. It is, I know it's not quite mud either, but it's somewhere in between. And then as you see the erosion of the dunes and the rising sea levels, it feels like a very fragile resource. So one of the questions we had was, can the beds be moved to a museum? Is there any other way of preserving these for posterity other than a sort of two-dimensional photo image?
Unfortunately, there isn't, is the short answer. I have done casting of footprints, and there is a small trail of footprints that are made of a mother and a baby in the museum in Southport. And in the River Severn, they tried to lift some of the mud that encapsulated footprints, but I don't know if they were able to preserve any of that mud. So unfortunately, the resource is finite. We don't know how far at Formby the footprints stretch under the sand dunes, because there's a couple of kilometers of sand dune before you actually get to Formby itself. So the mud could stretch all the way under there. We just don't know. But for sure, the beds that are on the coast at the moment that we see from time to time are gradually being eroded, and they are not very thick. And once they have gone, that's that resource lost. And I think in time it will be lost.
Yeah. So we've got a couple of other sort of things on a similar subject. I don't know whether Claire from Morecambe Bay Partnership wants to come in. So there's some comments about plaster casts, using just to preserve the shape of them, and then another one around making 3D models from the measurements, and potentially even 3D printing.
Yes, people have tried that, and that was what was done in the Southport display, that they made a 3D model of the trail, because I'd made the cast, and then from that they made a 3D model of the void of the footprint. But it's really quite difficult, because the coast is quite a challenging environment to work in a lot of the time. So you're either fighting the weather or you're fighting the tides, and you've got to have the right materials to be able to work in that environment. So when I first started doing casting, I did casting using polyfiller because I thought that would set quite quickly, but it wasn't good enough. And so unfortunately, I lost quite a few casts to the sea, and then eventually developed casting using dental plaster, which sets very rapidly and is a very fine grained plaster, so you can pick up the detail of the footprint. But it's not an easy process, unfortunately.
No. There's another question that's kind of linked, I think to this, and I'm going to slightly change the question, but kind of keep the spirit of it. We normally think of mud turning to stone over millions of years. It's a geological process, and yet there's something around the way that these prints are preserved, which is almost suggesting, it is on the journey, isn't it, towards becoming stone in actually almost historical timescales of only a few thousand years. So what's the shortest period that a mud deposit can turn into what we would consider stone?
I think I don't know if I can actually answer that question. I think it very much depends on the level of water, both in the ground that the mud's lying on and the saturation of the mud itself, um, and the amount of time that it would have to dry and harden before it was then sealed with some other kind of sand, sediment, or something like that. If a mud area has enough time to bake solid, it does become really quite like china clay.
Mm.
So over time, if that solidified enough, it would really bake. But I'm not sure that in our Northern European climate that we've ever been able to afford that much time for something to be preserved to that degree. And once it's covered, I don't think it would then solidify
Yeah.
very quickly at all.
Another linked question, or a kind of observation, and then a question from Richard, who lives at Hest Bank, on the sort of southeast corner of Morecambe Bay, saying that there are cliffs that are about 15 meters high, which are mud and rock, presumably glacial deposits. If the sea level has risen, then presumably there is more of this deposit underneath the cliff. So do we know sort of how deep the glacial deposits go down into the ground?
I think they can sometimes go several meters.
Yeah.
It varies very, very much on the topography and the conditions that were prevalent when the glaciers were beginning to recede. So I think it's a little bit difficult to say. There was a geologist called Tooley who did a lot of work in the Morecambe Bay area in the 1970s and 80s, and he did quite a lot of coring. So if that person's very interested, they might want to try and refer back to Tooley's work and see if they could get any more information from his research in the Morecambe Bay area.
Yeah. Some of those cliffs, I have to say, there's some ones as well around Wharton and Carnforth where they just look totally out of place around Morecambe Bay. You suddenly get these great big lumps of cliff with no other land attached to them. Okay, yeah, a couple more, more great questions. So quite near the beginning of the talk, you showed some maps of all the previous shorelines of the Irish Sea. Really almost looked like Cardigan Bay, didn't it? But with the Isle of Man and Anglesey kind of at either end. So how are those maps actually produced? How do we know information like that?
That was from the Paleolandscape Survey, and Fitch and Gaffney basically went out in a boat with a sonar machine and measured the topography of the base of the ocean, and were able to really very carefully draw up the topographical features that you see there. If you go to that reference, you'll be able to find a series of very good plans, drawings, and survey descriptions of how they went about doing the topography of the seabed there.
Right. Great, thank you. So the next one we've got, so there's a couple of sort of location specific questions. So one of them is that there's a fossil forest at Hoylake on the Wirral down near Liverpool. And then someone else asking about the same age of deposits at Humphrey Head near Grange. So both asking the same question: do we know of any footprints associated with either of those features?
Yes, at Hoylake, I have been out with one of the local archaeologists there, and we discovered human footprints and I think possibly wolf footprints. However, they haven't been specifically dated, so it's very hard to say that they're prehistoric. They seem to be heading out to Hilbert Island, which at the time when they could have been formed would have been attached to the mainland, now an intertidal island. And we know that just along from Hoylake was a very large submerged forest, which was removed in the Victorian era because it got in the way of the people bathing in the sea, which I think is a great shame. further north, I'm not sure. Grange over Sands is really interesting, and I think that there is scope for research there, but I don't know how old the muds are there because I've not seen any dating from that area, but I'm sure it's an area that is well worth observation.
Great, thank you. Just one more, and then there's a specific request that's come in as well. So I'm not quite sure how to frame this question because it isn't really a question. It's just more an observation. But there was quite a lot of chatter while you were giving your talk about some of the kind of extinct animals, certainly extinct from Britain,
Yes.
that you've found. So people not realizing that aurochs, for instance, were real. They thought they were a fictional creation within the world of Game of Thrones. And then some other questions asking about dire wolves and whether they were also actually a real sort of extinct species of wolf, or whether that was another creation. So I don't quite know how to frame the question, but you know, have you got any observations about what we can learn about some of these animal species that have vanished, or are there any particular amazing animal finds that have intrigued you?
Yes, I think one of the most interesting and extinct is the aurochs, and there aren't many footprints of aurochs in the beds at Formby, but when you see them you realize the size and stature of the animal. So that is really quite an amazing thing to see, because it is now extinct worldwide, and in this area in the UK became extinct in the Bronze Age. So we know that any of those footprints must be pre-Bronze Age, which I think is in itself quite stunning. I also like to see crane prints because there are quite a few areas of crane print along the coast, but again, it's an animal that we no longer have in the UK, and the prints are so big and often so pristine that they're very evocative. I have found what I think is wolf. I think it's Lupus lupus rather than any kind of Game of Thrones slightly mythical animal. But you know, you never know, do you?
No.
And then there are one or two very small hoof footprints that I found, and I don't know what they are. So there are some footprints that still elude me to identify, and it is possible that they relate to some form of small wild boar or something of that nature. I just don't know. And then there are one or two other footprints that look very much like cat, or they seem to have pads. So this is why I think it's probably lynx. But again, you know, that some of the footprints are so strange that I can't quite really be sure that I've identified them. So there is still more work to do, I think, on trying to identify
Yeah.
some of these lesser known hoof prints and
Yeah.
paw prints.
Yeah, it's fantastic. It kind of reminds you straight away, doesn't it, of the story about the unicorns who were too feckless to get on the ark before the great flood. Maybe that's what it is.
That's what it is.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Another one then that's just come in. Is there any chance of any of these footprints yielding DNA?
No, I don't think there is. They are just traces of the past rather than actual organic remains. So you might be able to get some DNA if you found a bone, but not
Yeah,
from the
yeah.
footprints.
Yeah, like the Walney one, I guess.
Yes, exactly.
Did you try and get DNA out of the Walney bone?
Unfortunately, we couldn't recover it.
Right.
The tide was coming in, and the next time we were able to go there, the next day, it had taken it, and I think that's extraordinary, really, because it was really embedded into the mud.
Yeah.
But we never managed to salvage it.
Right. We've got another one here about toenails again. Yeah, you need an embedded toenail that's somehow been preserved. Maybe with a bit of skin attached to it. I don't know. Great. So I don't know. Have you managed to get the first slide up?
That'd be the one.
Yeah. Yeah, I love the fact you can still see the river systems.
Yes, it is amazing, isn't it?
Yeah, it really
And
is.
you can see how the area near Hoylake on the Wirral has changed so much, and some areas have been much more eroded than others. The north of Wales hasn't had a great deal of sea incursion, whereas areas around the north of Morecambe Bay have had quite
Yeah.
extensive flooding.
Yeah. And there's a specific question here about the Loon Deeps. Where are the Loon Deeps on this map?
I don't know, but
I
I
wonder
would
if it's that
imagine
blue one. Yeah, I was thinking it's
somewhere
probably that
here.
blue one. Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah, off sort of off Blackpool and
yes, yeah.
yeah, yeah, and Fleetwood. Great. Well, thank you very, very much, Alison. We'll just one thing we like to do is trail future talks. So the next one that I've got as the official Morecambe Bay Partnership Sunset Series is Orchids, Ferns and Sundews on the 19th of January at the same time, 7 o'clock. So Tuesday night in 2 weeks' time, which is around a project called Back on Our Map that Morecambe Bay Partnership is involved in, bringing back some of the endangered and extinct species around the bay, sort of back from the brink. But Alison, a couple of times you've mentioned a talk next week. So do you want to trail that as well?
Oh, sorry, I'm not sure it's next week. I think it's up to Claire to
Okay.
decide what the timetable will be. But it's basically going to be along a similar subject, talking about identifying some of the paleoecology that would have existed along the coastline, and talking about safe working on the coast as well.
Yeah. Great. So that'll be kind of slightly more hands-on, sort of trying to encourage anyone inspired by tonight to become sort of budding community. I was going to say archaeologists. Is this archaeology or is this something slightly different, isn't it?
I'm going to say it absolutely is archaeology. Okay. Can I just say a few things about that, please, Tom?
Yeah, of course, Claire.
So this talk is really our launch point for the Forest Footprints and Fauna project. So what we're planning to do is we're going to run a series of workshops, initially on Zoom, teaching people how to identify and record these deposits, the footprints and the animal bones. And we would like some local volunteers who would be willing, once the restrictions have eased a little bit, to go out and monitor the remains along the coast. So as Alison has been saying, these remains are washed away really quickly, and it's really hard for archaeologists and other interested people to go out there and record them before they're washed away. So we're losing loads of information that can tell us so much about the landscape and people's lives in this time that we don't already know. So what we'd really like is some volunteers to come and help us record that, and we'll teach you all about how to do that recording, how to identify things, and also how to work safely on the coast. That's really important because obviously we don't want anybody getting injured or swept away while they're doing this. So we'd really love to see you there.
Presumably they'll be advertised as usual on the website.
Yes, absolutely. They'll be on the website, in our newsletters, and on social media.
Great. Well, we've certainly had quite a few people who I think are very interested, who are locally based.
Yes,
and then other people maybe from a bit further field who are now keen to visit once restrictions have eased and vaccinations have been rolled out, and everything. So yeah, I think you're definitely going to get some takers, and I think it does get to the heart, doesn't it, of Morecambe Bay Partnership and kind of. I think what we do that's so unique, which is involving the people who live and work around the bay, actually in learning and finding out more about and preserving, their own local heritage, whether that's natural or historical, or like this, where it's kind of hovering between the two. So yeah, thank you. It was really fascinating. It is a few comments I think have revealed it. It's a very emotive subject. It just kind of gets you, doesn't it, on a subliminal, subconscious level, I think.
Yeah, it really does.
It's very powerful. Good. So do you know what? There isn't a single one of these talks that hasn't been amazingly fascinating, because I think there's just something about people like yourself, Alison, who are just curious and want to know more and dedicate their lives to pursuing a topic. I think it is very infectious and very inspiring. So thank you very, very much for sharing a little bit of your work with us.
Thank you. It's my pleasure.
And thank you everybody for joining. And yeah, hopefully we will see you at future talks, either around the same subject or, as I said, we've got the Back on Our Map species rescue project on the 19th. We then have another historical one, which is Warton Crag, whether that's an Iron Age fort or not, on the 2nd of February. And then moving further forwards, we've got the 16th of February, which is the forgotten tragedy of the Matchless disaster, which I learned at the last talk was a famous shipping disaster that happened on Morecambe Bay about 100 years ago, a bit longer. Victorian, was it? 150 years ago. So yeah, well, thank you very much for joining. We'll see you on future talks, I hope.